So I spent this morning talking about various ways in which people try to release microdata and why naive approaches to anonymizing it and removing personally identifiable information don't work, or at any rate how they're easy to reverse. So what I'm going to do now is talk about slightly more elaborate ways of extracting sensitive and private information. There is no particular theory to it or principles. This is, it's right before lunch, so everybody is kind of hungry and anxious to get there. So this will mostly be a collection of anecdotes that will illustrate how information leaks out in unexpected ways and how sometimes you can recover things maybe in ways that system designers did not expect. So I showed you this picture before. This paradigm of protecting privacy by anonymizing or de-identifying the data and turning it to some kind of magic form without PII. And hopefully I convinced you by kind of ranting for 2 hours that this probably doesn't work, at least not the way people use it. So one reaction to this could be, well, that's all fine, but all I talked about is a release of fairly fine-grained information, like anonymized data sets, anonymized social networks, and so on. So maybe something someone could conclude from this is that if you don't release microdata, basically if you don't release data at all, if you just have a system that operates on the data but the data is never released, then it's going to be safe from the kind of attacks that I showed. And I showed attacks that exploit sparsity, I showed attacks that exploit structure, but maybe we need another tool in our armory, so to speak, if we're going to deal with situations where data is not released explicitly. And if you look at how sensitive data is used today, and this is what I'm personally very interested in, I mean, occasionally you still see data releases, but that's like kind of a big deal. To take a data set, anonymize it, and publish it, that's like a lot goes into that. But often what we see now is that sensitive data is used inside some algorithm, which is used inside some system for doing something. You never get explicit access to the data, identified or de-identified. All you get is, you get to interact with some system that somehow uses data inside, okay? And so an interesting question is, what could we infer about the data by interacting with these systems that operate on sensitive data? So you have some inputs and they go into some computation, and then the adversary gets to interact with this computation. Another interesting aspect of it is that often it's not a one-shot deal. And this is important because when I talked about de-anonymization and re-identification, I kind of kept emphasizing how it's wrong to think of it as kind of like just a one-shot thing. It's not like you get it and you try to identify it and then you either succeed or you fail. That it's actually a process. So you interact with the system, you learn something, you interact with the system again, you learn something more. So a process that feeds on itself. And in modern systems that operate on sensitive data, you often actually get repeated interactions with them. So, which means that you don't get just one observation of the system, you get multiple observations. And it turns out that this is especially valuable if the underlying data has changed. Okay, we'll see this again on Wednesday when I talk about machine learning models, especially if you have like models on incrementally changing data. But here I'm going to show one particular example of this. But the lesson here is that sometimes information leaks out gradually, so it's not just like one release gives you nothing, but if you have several consecutive releases, it gives you something. And it also sometimes leaks through very unexpected system interfaces and through various, I don't know what to call it, it's just like you have a system operating on the data, and like who knows like how creative an adversary can be interacting with that system. So the particular example I'm going to use for this is old. This is old work, but I'm going to use a somewhat newer example in a moment. But this is the work we did a few years back when we looked at collaborative filtering systems. And collaborative filtering, the idea behind it is very popular. That's used for recommender algorithms all over the place. All kinds of services use it. So, and I'm sure you've all seen it. You often, go to some, I don't know, music service, and you tell them which bands you like, and it tells you, oh, you know what, people who like these bands, they also like this other one, so you might want to hear it. So that's kind of the basis of recommendations. If you're an Amazon customer, you probably see it on Amazon a lot. People who bought these items also bought that item. So you see it in movie recommendation services, often with news articles. It tells you, oh, people who read these news articles, here is another news article that you might want to read. So this recommender systems, that's kind of the pretty essential feature of various e-commerce providers these days. And they're all based on collaborative filtering, meaning that they try to look at behavior of other users and make recommendations based on that behavior. But what's important here is that it's actually not as simple as they look at users similar to you and recommend to you what those users have done. This similarities are computed on kind of item by item basis. So it's based on item similarity, not on user similarity, which makes extracting information about this somewhat tricky. Okay, so I'm actually not gonna go into details of how these recommender systems work, in part because they're very sophisticated and there are pretty complex algorithms that do this, and people have paid a lot of money to develop them. And in general, from my perspective, I prefer to treat these things almost as black boxes, because this way the techniques we develop for inferring information from them are not dependent on their inner workings too much, and it's somehow life for me is simpler if I deal with black boxes. So, but somehow the point of these recommender systems, they take behavior of other users and they try to compute various statistical correlations from it that all have the flavor of people who like this also like that, and then these things become visible through the output of the system. So as someone interacting with the system, you don't actually see other users' behavior. You only see certain aggregate information on which recommendations are based. Often you don't even see even raw statistics on which these recommendations are based. You see these recommendations. So one interesting question that will allow me to talk a little bit about how you do inference and how kind of adversarial inference and how you can extract sensitive information from these systems that operate on sensitive data but don't give you access to the data directly is, well, like, how could I invert such an algorithm? So maybe I interact with a system and system produces some recommendations. Well, can I figure out somebody's purchases from by looking at these recommendations? Can I figure, like, what can I learn about what people are doing even though I don't have access to that information? I only have access to this recommendation lists that are based very indirectly on people's transactions. If we're living in this one-shot world, if all you see is recommendation lists, that maybe there is a way of doing it, but I wouldn't know how to do it. It seems hard because the relationship there is very indirect. In part because these recommendations are, as I already mentioned, they're really item-to-item recommendations. They're not user-to-item recommendations. Like, if the recommendations had the form, users like you did something, then maybe I would have an idea how to do an attack. Like maybe if I know something about you, I would create a fake user record that looks like you, and based on the recommendations given to me, I would figure out that you must have done something because my user is a clone of you. Makes sense, right? That's how an attack might have worked. But it's not going to work here because like the recommendations given to me are sort of separate for every item. So even if I create like a record that looks like you, not entirely clear, like the recommendations are going to be given on a like sort of individual item basis. It's not going to be based on somebody's similarity to the record I created. That makes life harder for inference. However, I do have some leverage here, which is that these item-to-item recommendations, I don't actually need to create anything. I mean, these item-to-item recommendations are public in the system. Like, if we're dealing with Amazon, you can go to the page corresponding to a particular product, and it'll actually tell you all the items associated with that item. So I don't need to create anything. I can just passively look at what the system is producing, and I can learn this item-to-item recommendations list without actually having to actively create anything in the system. So that's just the public output of the system. But again, like if my goal is to infer certain things just by looking at a static snapshot of what these recommendations are, unclear what it gives me. However, it's not a static snapshot. I can watch a system over time. I can make repeated observations. And since these things are public, you know, nobody's stopping me. I can do it for a very long time. For this particular paper, we actually performed observations for 2 years. We had to watch certain things to infer something. But again, since it's a totally passive thing, you know, I just, you know, every day I could come to some web page and like a music service, I could see what music is being recommended for somebody who liked a certain band, or what movies are being recommended to someone who watched a certain movie and liked it. All right, so where am I going with this? It turns out that how things change over time could be very revealing. So earlier this morning, I already talked about sparsity of the data as being important. I talked about structure of the data being important. And here is the third factor, which only comes into play when we're not dealing with static data releases, when we're dealing with repeated releases of information, that the dynamics of public outputs of systems that operate on sensitive data could reveal a lot about changes of this underlying data and could allow certain forms of inference. I do need some auxiliary information, as always, to do anything here. But maybe that's not too hard to come by in many settings. So let's just assume for the sake of the argument that I have a victim or a target in mind, and I know something about them. Okay, so I have a very partial information about their record. And as always, in this class of attacks, just like the other things I talked about this morning, my goal is to leverage this auxiliary information into something more, to learn something about their record that I don't already know. So I know a little bit, I want to learn the full thing, or at any rate, I want to learn more. So for the same reasons that I talked about for the past 2 hours, transaction histories, preferences, and so on tend to be unique, and they tend to be unique even when projected to like a very small number of dimensions. So chances are, if I know a partial history, this partial history is uniquely identifying. So in this case, let's just assume that this is a TV episode, like some TV series that somebody watched. In this particular case, I mean, actually, this is not uniquely identifying, but I'm just going to use this for simplicity, just so I can illustrate how the general inference technique here works. Okay, so modern collaborative filtering, as I already mentioned, it's kind of item-based. And it's also dynamic, meaning that these recommendation lists, they're updated based on people's behavior. So here is how it's going to work. So if you liked certain, in this case, TV series, certain items in the available universe of items, if you then like something else, these algorithms are gonna, like, I'm trying to, sorry, I'm a little like tongue-tied here. I'm trying to explain it without like any math at all, just by hand waving, because I don't have any slides on the math. But sorry, any math on the slides. But the idea is that if you have certain items that are associated with you, and then you select another item, then that item you selected and all items in your previous history, they somehow become closer together. They become more closely associated in this big matrix of which items are associated with items. The fact that they become more closely related, because a user that liked this set of items now selected some additional item, it actually becomes reflected in the public output of the system. So what this tells you is that how system produces these recommendation lists, it's not arbitrary. It happens in response to actions users do in the system. So they select a certain item, and this item becomes more related to the user's past choices, which typically means that it becomes more closely associated with these past choices. And if you look at their recommendation lists, even though they are on per item basis, you look at recommendation lists associated with previous items, the new item becomes more strongly associated with all of them. Okay? So I kind of said a lot of words here, so let's just look at a very greatly simplified example of something, of how something like this might work. So this is the partial history that we know. And let's say Alice, our victim here, watches a new show today. We actually don't know that this has happened. All we know is that this is somebody who watched these shows in the past, but we don't know that she watched it today. We don't know which show she watched. We don't know anything. However, we do have some public information. That is, for each of the items that we know are associated with Alice, we know just from public recommendations produced by the system, which items are associated with this. And we can watch these items, every day we could look at them. And then one fine morning, we notice a change in these lists. As a matter of fact, we notice a correlated change in this list, meaning that they all change, or a majority of them changes in a certain way. We see that a certain show goes up in the ranking of items associated with one of these. If this just happens for one show on the list, there isn't a whole lot that we can conclude from this. But suppose we see a correlated change across all of these lists. Maybe it appears on a whole bunch of them, or on the ones where it was already there, the strength of association becomes stronger, meaning that it goes up in the ranking. We don't actually, for many services, we would not see the actual correlation, but we can infer relative correlation because it would order them according to the strength of association. And if we see something like this happening, at this point we can start making inferences. What inference can we make? If we see this change, if we watch all these lists associated that we believe are associated with items that are associated with a certain person, so there is an extra level of interaction there, but all of a sudden we see that some item appeared on all of them and became strong, association became stronger with each one of the items on our list. So what could we try to conclude from this? Apparently nothing. So, well, maybe what it tells us is that if all of these items in our watch list at the top are associated with a person, then simultaneous appearance of one of the items in all of the lists maybe means that that item became associated with the person. And maybe from this we can infer that this item became associated with Alice, who is our target there. I'm trying to keep it like as sort of simple and as intuitive as I can without like going into like any details of any algorithms here or not, just trying to convey some intuition here for how something like this might work. So judging by the silence, I'm not succeeding super well here, but that's okay. I'm gonna go to lunch soon. Okay. So roughly the idea is this. So you look at the public outputs that are associated with various items in the system. You look at them as a group. And if the group happens to be associated with a single person, then simultaneous change in the recommendation lists linked to the group can indicate that a certain item became associated with that person, allowing inference from the dynamic outputs of the system. So, and by the way, there is kind of an important distinction here that I need to make. So, this is inference, not prediction, meaning that it sort of sounds similar to what a normal recommendation service is going to be doing, because a normal recommendation service is going to be telling you, you know, based on the fact that you watch certain movies, like watch this other movie, or based on the fact that you like certain TV series, you're going to like this other series. But that's sort of the opposite of what we're doing here. The goal of prediction is to infer, or to predict something that's true for like a whole group of people, whereas our goal here is to infer something that's true for a particular individual, okay? That's kind of the whole distinction between prediction and inference. And the only reason like our experiments here succeed to some extent is precisely because we're kind of looking at this group of items that are associated with one individual in the data set. And by watching like simultaneous change in all of this, we're trying to find not like a fact that's true about some subset of the population. We're trying to find like something that characterizes a unique individual in there, which is the appearance of an item in their viewing history, which results in the change that we can observe through the public outputs of the system. All right. And again, like even the goals here are different because these predictions or recommendations, they try to impose some order on this, whereas our inferences are based on temporal changes in this order. Okay, yeah. But we don't see, like in the original setting, I actually had the person's record. But here I don't have the person's record. All I have are item-to-item recommendations. So sorry, I need to go back here. Like, I don't actually see the thing at the top. I only see, for each of these independently, I see the lists that are kind of hanging to the bottom here. And I get to observe changes in the list. Of course, if somebody released, I wouldn't need any of this if somebody just released the records. But what I'm describing here is a system that doesn't release the records. It just, for individual items, it gives me a list of other items that are associated with this. And I'm trying to infer some information by finding groupings of these items that I believe are associated with a person and then watching change in them. So that's why I need like something more elaborate here.
One more question. In this process, does it help if you also check that items not associated with Alice don't have this like correlated?
Yes, it actually, yes, of course. Because otherwise you're going to get a ton of false positives because like something becomes popular, okay, and it becomes associated with everybody because everybody watches it. It raises an all list. So that is a very important factor that we need to take into account, is that not only it increases in, like, association strength increases for the subset of items associated with our target, it has to not increase everywhere else. Otherwise, you know, some new thing becomes, like, I don't know, new Star Wars movie comes out, like everybody goes and watches it, and its strength of association goes like across the board. And you also, like, it only works, by the way, if that set of items we're watching is really uniquely associated with one person, because we tried to do the same experiment. It sort of worked with, like, movies and various other things, but it didn't work with some book recommendation service. But that because it turned out that a lot of users there are actually public libraries. Yeah, anyway, so that, and yeah.
Who's the adversary? Is it Bob that knows the analysis? There is an individual with a very specific set of recommendations that you have some knowledge of?
Yes, yes. So I was, I mean, the adversary is really the same as throughout this morning. It's somebody who has auxiliary information about a particular individual who is in the data set. So yeah.
But any model, right, like if it's being tweaked by one person doing it, and it's most likely that's a wrong model. It's one user is changing the weights so much.
Well, it's a wrong model. I don't know. But how else would such a thing work, right? So if you have relatively rare items that you bought, and let's talk Amazon, something like Amazon. I mean, this particular experiment is a little hard to do on Amazon, but okay, let's just work with that as an example. So there are items on Amazon for which they would give you a list of like 100 related items. Like, this list could be really long, okay? There are plenty of things there that relatively few people buy, okay? So now if you're a purchaser of one of these things, okay, and you buy something else, like, the strength of association between that other thing you bought, the new thing, and the old thing that's relatively rare will increase. And the new thing will appear on the association list of the old thing. And I don't know how, like, I mean, like, that's inevitable. So maybe it's not the right system, but that's kind of how this whole collaborative filtering thing works. And the effect that I'm describing is inevitable because, like, same reason as everything else this morning, sparsity. It's like, for any item that you have, the fraction of users who are associated with that item is, like, negligible in the whole population of users, and vice versa. You know, every user is associated with only a negligible fraction of items. So when a user becomes associated with items, you're affecting a small number of users and a small number of items. Okay. So, but it is true that if instead of the list being like 100 items long, there are only like 5 items long, that attack would become very hard, because in order for association become so strong as to get into the top 5 list, like, lots of users would have need to buy it. Yeah. Sorry, I'm like hand waving like crazy, but I hope, you know, I'm communicating like that it only works if you get to observe the tail of the recommendation list. It doesn't work on the top of the recommendation list, because the changes at the bottom are linked to like a small number of users. Changes at the top are linked to like hundreds of users. Yeah.
Just wondering if we can invest some stuff, not even about the specific reference of the user, but you can sometimes just realize that, you know, these guys actually trend followers, they always go to what to recommend.
So, right. But it's not like.
It is stateful, right? It's always.
Yeah, well, that's not going to mess this up, because like when the item appears, it's a result of the transaction. So like the trend followers, like they only act after it appears on the recommendation list. I'm trying to trace back the reason for appearance of something, like simultaneous appearance of an item on a whole bunch of lists, where the only thing these lists have in common is that they're associated with one person. All right. Okay. let me now talk about how we do inference these days. This is somewhat newer work. So it turns out that like doing this work that I described, which was like several years ago, required, you know, like teasing information from these changes and so on, required us to like, you know, do a lot of work and develop sophisticated algorithms and so on. So these days, my work is much easier. So I actually don't have to do anything smart at all. And my students don't have to do anything. We just use machine learning, okay? So it turns out that for inference these days, if you don't understand like the structure of the relationships in the data, if you don't understand how exactly data leaks out, just throw machine learning at the problem and yeah, it'll work. I'm sort of exaggerating, but not really. So just to finish for today, let me show you sort of at a latter day inference, so to speak, how we do it now. And it's not going to be very illuminating because I'm not actually going to tell you like anything, okay? I'm just going to sort of explain, like, not explain, like illustrate, like tell you an anecdote about like a super brute force approach to inference, which nevertheless works amazingly well. So, and this will actually also be an advertisement for what I'm going to be talking about on Wednesday, because on Wednesday I'll talk about, I mean, this is just like nothing today, but on Wednesday I'll try to tell you something a little more meaningful. Okay, so anyhow, as you probably know, there is like a revolution going on, you know, like deep learning revolution, like big time. As I like to say about this, I think the popular narrative is something like, you know, Facebook is better than humans at recognizing cats, I think, and like Google is better than humans at recognizing dogs, and like pretty soon AI overlords are gonna like take over the universe. At least something like that goes. But there is this deep learning thing out there that seems to be like amazingly effective at like all kinds of things, especially that have to do with like recognition problems and classification problems. And of course, you know, being a privacy researcher, I kind of gotta wonder, like, what does this mean for me as a privacy researcher? Both in terms of machine learning introducing new forms of information leakage. So that's what I'm going to be talking about on Wednesday. But today, I'm just going to talk about using this as a tool, because maybe all these like hard inference problems that in the old days took me like and my students a lot of effort to come up with various like ad hoc algorithms and various heuristics for solving it. Maybe I don't need to do it anymore because machine learning is becoming so good, maybe it can do it for me. It would be disappointing if that were true because there would be no need for me, but unfortunately it does seem to be true, okay? So that's why on Wednesday I'll talk about like, you know, I'll use it not just as a tool for replacing me, but also as a source of new problems where I hopefully cannot be replaced. All right, so, but let's talk about this whole thing about outperforming humans. So I was kind of curious last year, you know, like how good this thing is at, you know, at certain tasks like object recognition and images. People claim like modern machine learning based on neural networks is pretty darn good. I was just curious, you know, how good. So, so here are several images of a truck at different resolutions, and we just like, you know, tried some trained object recognition models that are trained to recognize trucks in the image to see like at which point they're going to fail. So if you look at the first image here, like humans are pretty good at recognizing this as a truck, and these neural networks are pretty good too. So the second image, well, maybe it's sort of like for a human, it's kind of truck-like. So it turns out like neural networks trained to recognize trucks have absolutely no problem recognizing truck there. Let's pixelate a little more. So at this point, it's not really human recognizable. Amazingly, these models still like do a pretty good job. And even like that one is good. So this is pretty badly pixelated, and turns out that like doesn't fool a trained neural network. At which point, like that kind of turned me into a believer, as in like, whoa. I mean, these things are pretty good. I don't know what exactly it's speaking on. I mean, I have like a hunch what it's speaking on at this image. But anyway, once I saw this gave me an idea. And the idea is this, like, well, you know, maybe all these privacy protection methods for images, you know, maybe they're just as crappy as all these anonymization methods I described this morning. And maybe there is an easy way of showing it. So what we decided to do, and this was a really, you know, kind of a throwaway experiment that took like, you know, a week to do, or like 2 weeks. You know, let's see what people use for image protection and privacy mechanisms that people use for image protection. And like, I'm not even gonna try to do like, you know, any sophisticated inference. I'm just gonna do it by brute force. I'm gonna throw neural networks at the problem and see how well these neural networks do. So we looked at a whole bunch of like so-called image obfuscation techniques, such as pixelation. Well, I'm sure you've all seen pixelation. This is just, you know, you take a block of the image and you just average all pixels and replace the image with a block. We looked at blurring, and the particular form of blurring we looked at is actually on YouTube now. You can use it automatically. I don't know what algorithm they use, but you can upload a video and tell it blur all faces, and it's going to replace every face with a blur. And we also looked at actually research technology, which was published in a research paper and actually commercialized as a startup called P3. So pixelation and blurring, I mean, it's pretty obvious what they do. P3 actually need to describe. This is something that was published in a very respectable systems conference. And like I said, there is a startup based on it. And again, this is one of these kind of very plausible privacy protection ideas that sort of kind of make a lot of sense, maybe if you read it for the first time. And the idea is this. So you want to protect privacy of images for whatever reason. Like maybe you want to upload, you know, image into a public photo storage, but you don't want operators of the storage to look at the image. So one idea would be to encrypt it and upload ciphertext. But that's actually not good for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, that if you actually try to encrypt an image and upload it to Facebook, you will not be able to. Facebook is going to reject the image, and Instagram is going to reject the image, because it's actually like they would not accept anything that's not formatted as a JPEG, and the ciphertext is not formatted as a JPEG, so it's a non-starter. And second is, they like to do all these things on images like compression for storage and for transmission and so on, and you cannot do that on an encrypted image very well. So the idea behind P3 is kind of very simple and intuitive. You take the JPEG, you know, very standard image format, and JPEG is kind of like, basically it's like a Fourier decomposition of the image. So you have significant coefficients and less significant coefficients. And the whole idea behind this privacy protection technique for images is that you encrypt just the significant coefficients, and since there are few of them, that results kind of in a very nice, small, compact ciphertext that you communicate like offline out of band somehow. And then whatever remains, the least significant coefficients, you upload to your service and kind of treat as an image. And since these are least significant coefficients, they kind of look like white noise, right? So if a human looks at this, it looks like this thing on the right, even though it comes straight from the original image without any transformation. And furthermore, all kinds of like signal processing techniques also fail on this image. So that's how they evaluate privacy. In that paper, they try, you know, let's try edge detection, let's try face detection, let's try like all kinds of like signal processing things for image analysis, and none of them work given just this part of the image that consists of least significant JPEG coefficients. However, if you think about this for a second, of course, like you realize, I'm leaking information because it's not like, I mean, this is not white noise. In reality, these least significant coefficients, I mean, they are correlated with the information you're hiding. But this dependence is not very obvious. It's not easy, you know, to reconstruct analytically and so on. But fortunately, as you'll see in a moment, you don't have to. And by the way, they do provide like this trade-off. You can sort of decide how many coefficients to encrypt, how many coefficients to release. And you can see, this is what it looks like at one of their recommended thresholds. So this is the secret part of the image. This is the public part of the image. And, that public part of the image looks like pretty useless as in terms of recovering information. Yeah. I don't think you can see anything in this. Okay, I mean, if in the olden days, I'd have to work pretty hard to figure out how to extract information from this, but these days I don't have to. All I need to do is to buy a couple of GPUs, find a student who knows how to like stick them into a machine, and then just train a neural network to recognize images based on like the thing on the left. Okay, just give it a whole bunch of training examples. Like this is the original image, this is the least significant coefficients, and so on. Now, what I'm doing here is not a recovery of information. It's a recognition task, right? So I have a finite number of possibilities in the protected image. I mean, in the sort of privacy protected image, whether pixelated, blurred, or protected using this P3 thing. And I'm asking the network to recognize certain objects in the image. Okay? And it turns out, and we tried it on a whole bunch of like standard image recognition tasks, such as recognizing handwritten digits, recognizing objects. So this MNIST, CIFAR, the fruit flies of image recognition research, so to speak. Well, which digit is this? There is a handwritten digit in here. So unfortunately, you have an answer in front of you, so I cannot, do my usual thing of like challenging you to guess what it is. Most people think it's a 2, some people think it's a 4. Turns out it's a 7, and it's difficult for a human to do. It's different for like existing signal processing techniques to do. For a neural network trained on a whole bunch of like original digits and like transformed digits, turns out there is no problem whatsoever recognizing that this number is 7. So somehow this deep learning techniques that people use for object recognition these days, they are extremely good at, given enough training examples, they're extremely good at finding like whatever subtle features remain in the image. There's like little correlations between least significant coefficients and more significant coefficients that you can train them to perform recognition very well, as long as there is some information remaining to the image that somehow correlated with information that was removed, which is true for blurring, which is true for P3, which is true for pixelation. You don't have to explicitly specify like what these correlations are. Modern deep learning networks are actually like very good at discovering these correlations by themselves. Somehow they don't tell you what these correlations are, but you can train them on lots of examples to do this, and they do a pretty good job, as this example illustrates. And so we tried it like with a whole bunch of examples. So I already mentioned like MNIST, which is handwritten digits, and CIFAR, which is object recognition. We also tried it with various face recognition data sets. So again, it's not reconstructing the face, it's recognizing the face, right? So you know that the face comes from a small number of possibilities. Well, small could be a few hundred, and you're asking which of these few hundred is in the image. And we tried all these like techniques like pixelation or mosaicing and P3 at various resolutions. And it's pretty convincing because like you look at these things on the right, like, P3 at like level 10 or 20, and like there is a lot of, at least to a human eye, there is a lot of information loss. Well, not, but in the face of this, pun intended, in the face of these techniques, it turns out they work still very well because there is enough features for them to pick up and in order to be able to do accurate recognition. So these are some charts that are showing the results, but bottom line is that for at the levels of privacy protection that are recommended for like commercial use of these systems, their performance gets close to performance of networks that are trained on unobfuscated images. So it's as if the privacy protection technique like doesn't exist at all. So they achieve same level of accuracy. But to be clear, I mean, these are networks that are trained to recognize obfuscated images, okay? These are not networks trained to recognize original images. And that makes a lot of sense because they need to look at a different set of features and they need to learn to recognize different things in it. But again, I mean, since these techniques are public, you can just generate a lot of training examples. So that's exactly what we did. We took a bunch of like YouTube videos, fed them into YouTube, got back videos with blurred faces, and generated like thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of examples of like blurred faces in the videos, fed them into the neural network, and came up with a neural network that is pretty good at recognizing blurred faces in videos. Yeah. You need, okay. So you do need, of course, an original face, but it doesn't have to be like exactly that picture of the face. So you could have slightly different versions of the same face. Makes sense, right? There have to be photos of the same person who is being blurred, but not exactly the photo that has been blurred. But of course, you need examples. I mean, it's an image recognition task, so you can only train it to, you do need to give it unobfuscated photos of the same person and obfuscated versions of the same photo, and then you give it an obfuscated version of a new photo and tell it, is it that person or one of the other people, and it picks the right person with pretty high accuracy. Okay, so these are the results of face recognition, which, you know, now, I mean, if it's there are a lot of kind of moving parts here, as in like it has to be trained on approximately the same faces, like if there is significant difference in lighting and so on, it doesn't work so well, so I'm not going to go into this. So why am I showing you all of this? It actually turns out, like my purpose of showing this experiment is like very simple, is that modern machine learning is actually pretty darn good, okay? And the scary part about it is that as an inference tool, it's extremely easy to use. And there are a lot of like first of all, like the first lesson here is there are a lot of privacy protection technologies there that try to argue privacy by appealing to some kind of vague criterion as like humans look at it and they don't recognize it, or I tried a bunch of like kind of signal processing attacks and they didn't work. So they're not even like robust to kind of off-the-shelf neural networks. But also, so that's the first lesson. But the second lesson is more important, which is as long as there is structure in the data, and you are releasing something that's correlated with what's being hidden, it's not going to be secure. At least like in the sense that people want it to be secure, which actually happens to be unachievable, but nevertheless. Like people often want like, okay, I want to release something about my data and keep some secrets, but the thing I'm releasing is correlated with the thing I'm hiding. All right, but it turns out that today, for this thing to fall apart completely, you don't even need an attacker who understands these correlations explicitly, okay, and analytically. It's enough to have enough examples of original thing and privacy protected thing, and you can just like, in a very blind and brute force fashion, you can just train a machine learning model to infer the thing that is being hidden from the thing that is being published. As long as there are dependencies in there, you don't need to specify them analytically. You can just train a system to recognize these dependencies. And this is really bad news for these like kind of super ad hoc privacy protection technologies, because the task that they're trying to achieve, which is like hiding information regardless of adversaries' knowledge, it's basically unachievable, and it's never going to be achievable. And if anything, like the situation is going to become worse because, I mean, not that it was achievable before, but before you needed to do something clever to reconstruct this hidden information, and now you don't have to do anything. You just need lots of examples, and you throw them in a off-the-shelf framework and invest like $1,000 in a GPU and off you go. So these inference attacks are becoming available to you too, madam, could be an inference attacker. So, which basically means that we need some definition of privacy that is not just like, I'm going to hide this thing no matter what the adversary knows. I'm going to release a whole bunch of information that's related to this thing, and this thing is still going to be secure. So that definition of privacy is not going to lead to any place happy, but like maybe we're going to have a better definition of privacy after lunch, maybe. All right, okay. I'm done.